Welcome to the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Dank Christian Memes is a community on reddit.com where all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians share memes and fellowship. Our podcast covers topics related to faith, culture, current events, and Reddit. Thank you for listening. All right. Hey, Jacob.
Yeah.
So we are starting season 2, and I want to thank you for both modding and podding with me.
I want to thank you likewise, Broclen. You've done more work than I have. So,
well, it may appear that way, but I believe that I keep coming back to you and others and squeezing more knowledge out of you. So it's at least a shared effort, if not an outright exploitation.
It's a team thing.
But we've been doing it for a little while over at Dank Christian Memes on Reddit, and we're still going. So thanks, for that, and doing the extra credit with the podcast and everything else. We appreciate it.
I'm definitely having fun on here. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't enjoying it.
That's good. Well, I know you're a heavily committed person, and I'll also confess that I've caught up with your other podcasts. So I think that makes me officially a fan.
That means you've caught up with Andrews too. So
I think so. Well, I never know because I keep finding more podcasts, or you guys keep making them. So I'm never certain what's around the corner. But Andrew, thanks for also being here and being our continued Catholic authority. We need it. I'm a filthy Protestant, so I need a little guidance from a more ordered tradition, to put it nicely.
Of course, always happy to lend my voice. I don't know if I could say I'm a Catholic authority, but being a Catholic
scholar, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think of you as an authority. You're my go-to, and I think there's been a couple issues where like, you know what, I'm going to ping Andrew on this. So
scholar,
you're my authority.
He tends to know.
Yeah, I can do scholar. Authority might get me in some trouble with my bishop. But
I know. Well, that's the Protestant side that needs to be moderated. So that's
Andrew for anti-pope.
Andrew for anti-pope.
No.
Oh dear. Oh dear. The memes, they would be so spicy. So before we dig into our main subject, which is a bit spicy, maybe science and religion, science versus religion, we'll see. And we're using religion as a bit of shorthand here. But first, I'm going to go over some Reddit news, and there's been some Reddit news. So first, for those who maybe haven't listened to all the episodes, we forgive you. But we have shifted to recording on Discord from recording on Reddit Talk. Reddit Talk was a voice feature included in Reddit, and now it's gone. So we're on Discord, and that's working well for us. But something else that changed on Reddit is Reddit changed their API, the way their software interacts with other software, and that was an issue. There was a lot of really good reporting on it, so I'm going to try not to tread. If you Google search Reddit API changes and protests, you'll find some great articles that are going to light your way. But what didn't get so much attention, something we tried to focus on Dank Christian Memes, was the blind community on Reddit, specifically our blind and transcribers of Reddit. And a lot of folks don't know this. I don't know, Jacob, if you've seen any of this while modding with me, but there are folks, or had been folks, transcribing memes on Dank Christian Memes for blind folks or vision impaired folks who couldn't see them otherwise, who relied on that transcription.
It's an impressive effort too. Like when I think it was even a more pervasive thing a few years back, where most posts you'd go to would have a transcription at them, because people were really devoted to making things available for blind Redditors. And so I'd like to personally thank all the people who did that for all the time that was open.
Yeah, because that was such a great service and it worked for so many people. And I think the biggest reason we saw it was just because they included a link. So like we just, make sure all our links are on the up and up. And of course they are. But unfortunately, they don't have the tools because of these API changes to do that anymore. So that is something that's we once had and now we're lacking. So Reddit says they're going to try to play catch up, and hopefully they hold true to that. But we are still waiting on many things to improve for the blind and vision impaired community. Aside from that, Reddit has also decided to do away with awards. Some people didn't like awards when they started. Some people have come to sort of expect them. For us, we used awards to reward the top meme of the year with the Golden Jesus Award, which is a little controversial, but he's going to be removed in December. So, Jacob, if you see anything that tickles your fancy, maybe just hand out those awards, because we have that gold there, so it's going to evaporate. So if you see something that maybe isn't getting the upvotes, but you liked it, go ahead and give it give it your seal of approval before we lose the opportunity. But the top meme of the year, the person who posts that does get the title and user flair based bishop. They can't take that from us, or they haven't yet. So we will do that. So that's probably the biggest changes on Reddit for right now as it pertains to us. Did I miss anything before we go into our main topic?
No, I think we've been running as we usually do for the most part. I'm ready to move on when you are.
Yeah. So here's the question for me, and how clickbaity do I want to be when we discuss this topic? Because for me, my point of view on this really comes to, can't we all just get along? I was raised in the United Church of Christ, and there was never any conflict between science and our faith. If anything, one informed the other. And many Christians I've talked to outside of my own tradition have a relative comfort with a lot of scientific matters that are sometimes considered to be gotchas. And I don't want to dig into anything quite yet. But so I want to examine these things, but I also want to point out that I feel like, kind of like we talked about in our creationism thing, that I don't have a heavily committed position on a lot of this, that when science informs me of things, I say, oh yeah, okay. And when I read a new theologian, I take in that information, and I can't ever imagine a time in my youth or in my adulthood where those two things were actually in conflict with each other. But that's not everyone's experience. So right. I don't want to make it seem like it is. So, Andrew, I want to come to you first, because I feel like we get ourselves into a little bit of a historical issue where, before everything that happened before Martin Luther, if it was good, the Catholic Church did it. And if it was bad, well, it was the Catholic Church's fault. And I feel like this, we often fall into a monolithic view of the church, which in many people's eye turns out to be the Catholic Church. And my understanding is that the Catholic Church as an institution, historically, has actually been pretty pro-science. And the way it was explained to me, and I'd love for either of you to correct this, because this is something a professor told me. There were no citations, there were no links. But that a lot of what we see as scientific debate actually had more to do with the politics of respectability and the papacy at the time. That it wasn't so much my ideas, but the way you were presenting them. So, Andrew, is this a uniquely difficult position as a Catholic, or is this just a matter of explaining the history to people who just might not know it?
Yeah. Well, I think the position as it sits now is very straightforward. But the Catholic Church has had a somewhat complicated history with science and scientists. I mean, I think the Galileo affair is probably the most notorious. And there were definitely a lot of political things going on there. To say it was purely theological.
We've covered that before on our podcast. To link over.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Feel free to link to the appropriate
podcasts
podcasts
Potting
of your
Through
own.
Religion coverage of the Galileo affair that we've done before. If you're more interested in the details.
Yeah, if you want to go into detail, Potting Through Religion is the podcast Jacob and I do together. And we have a whole episode on science in the church. And we talk about the Galileo affair, among other things. So it's a somewhat...
My understanding of the affair was that Galileo, his ideas aside, he didn't have a good relationship with the institution, or at least the leaders of the institution. And that was a problem more than anything.
Yeah, I think, you see that. And I think when you take him in the context of someone like Copernicus, who also questioned this idea of the Earth as the center of the universe. However, Copernicus was maybe a little bit wiser and waited until he was on his deathbed to authorize the publication of his works. But yeah,
interesting strategy,
right? Yeah, what are they going to do when you're dead? But the Galileo affair was certainly very political in nature. And I will say, to the Catholic Church's credit, and it took them until the 1990s, but they did apologize for the Galileo affair. And a lot of change in the Catholic Church since then. But if we look through the history of the Catholic Church on the whole, they are very pro-science. The biggest funder of Western scientific advancement and discovery is the Catholic Church. Many great religious institutions had scientists. Many great academic institutions were funded by the Church. The papacy
itself. The current Pope, isn't Pope Francis, doesn't he have a bit of a scientific background as well?
Oh, that I don't know. I don't actually know what his degrees are in, but the Jesuits are kind of famous for having extremely high educated.
You can probably hear me. You can probably hear me typing furiously.
Doesn't
chemistry,
Jesuit
philosophy, and theology.
Oh wow.
Yep.
Doesn't Jesuit membership require you to have a degree in a non-religious field as well?
Yes, that's part of, as I understand it, from what the Jesuits I've known have told me, part of your process of seminary and part of why it takes like a decade is that you have to get a degree in a non-theological field, or you have to like really be into theology.
I know that, speaking as an outsider, I know that Pope Benedict sometimes got labeled as being anti-scientific for some of his positions. And I think that I think a lot of folks just didn't understand the theological positions he was taking, whether they agreed with them or not. But I feel like, let me ask you, do you think that this is a sign that, popes are going to have to kind of step up to the Jesuit standard a little bit and have a competency in a science, if not, any other non-theological field? Could that be a benefit, or do you think that this is just a coincidence now that looks nice to outsiders like me?
Well, I don't know if it'll be a new standard, but I certainly believe that it is important for the Pope to have people around him who are very scientifically minded and literate, and would be willing to take on their advice. So, to kind of step back about a century, I guess a little more than a century now, for the last little over 100 years, the firm position of the Catholic Church has been that there is a non-contradiction between science and religion. And this is built on hundreds of years of precedent. Again, you can go through and you can find Jesuits and many non-Jesuits who are phenomenal scientists. And if you look at just the 20th century alone, like so many important scientific theories were the work of priests and nuns, including the Big Bang Theory, interestingly enough.
And early genetics, correct? Like, wasn't it a monk who was working on pea plants?
Gregor Mendel, yeah.
Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, Catholic priest. So many important scientific discoveries, and the church isn't like, oh, you discovered genetics, heresy, But I think one document I always like to point out is that in November of 1893, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical, which an encyclical is a letter written by a pope to the church at large, and it's kind of like the highest status a letter can be. So it's pretty much an official communication from the Pope to.
But it's not an ex cathedra statement, right?
No, it's not. No, it's a step down from that. Yeah. So
Gotcha.
Ex cathedra has only been used, I believe, 3 times. So whereas encyclicals, I mean, Pope Francis has written, I think, 3 during his time. The most famous of which is Laudato Si, which is one on kind of the earth and the world and creation and how we care for it. But in 1893, Pope Leo XIII wrote encyclical Providentium Deus. My Latin is not great, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But in this encyclical, he really
I bet you my Latin is worse.
Probably. He laid out some important thoughts around science and religion. And in it, he said, no real disagreements can exist between theologians and scientists, provided each keeps within his own limits. If nevertheless there is disagreement, it should be remembered that the sacred writers, or more truly, the Spirit of God who spoke through them, did not wish to teach men such truths, which do not help anyone to salvation. So basically what he's laying out is this idea, this almost dichotomy between the scriptures as the communication of the transcendent and divine dimension, and the sciences as the understanding of the immanent and temporal dimension. So when we see, I think the classic example in the pitting science versus religion is Adam and Eve, right? So the way the Catholic Church interprets that is that there is a religious truth being communicated through that story, even if the scientific evidence, seems to prove or show that 2 humans did not just kind of come out of nowhere and then, humans existed.
So I feel like sorry, go ahead.
So the Catholic Church affirms evolution, but it also affirms the truth of man being created in God's image and sin entering through man into the world that you find in Genesis.
So, Jacob, I want to bring this question to you because I know you come from sort of a different spot, and we talked about that a bit during creationism. But to what extent are we maybe just asking different questions and expecting, weird that this is an epistemological issue?
Yeah,
and that for many of us that there is no conflict, and yet for others, the conflict is very, very real.
Right. I would start this discussion, I think, as a way of shoring up every later aspect of this discussion. We really should define science and religion both, because frankly, when people use the terms, they often mean socialist phenomena they associate with the two.
I'm talking about the church, and I've fallen into a mistake that a lot of people do, is using the term religion as shorthand for the church, which is a rookie mistake, and I should not have made it.
Right.
But beyond that, I think the definition of science is a bit of the issue at hand. That, is this a question of science? Is this a question of theology, philosophy, or something else? And are we just kind of talking across each other?
Right. So science necessarily, well, the historical meaning of the term comes from a Latin term that essentially means knowledge. But when we talk about scientific methodology, which comes out of European natural philosophy, but really has precursors in cultures all over the world, what we're talking about is a system of measured testing of hypothesis, right? Make a hypothesis, gather data, and test the hypothesis against the data to refine it for the next experiment. All scientific inquiry relies on measurability. It relies on repeatability. It relies on the capacity of any experiment to be tested again by either repetition or adding more data through time and discovery.
Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed out perfectly that religion, and we'll say Christianity or issues of the church, tend to not be testable in the same way that scientific matters are. unless you make a doomsday or a return of Jesus prediction, which of course has a pretty low accuracy rate. I'm going to just go ahead and say
Howard Camping did make a hypothesis, and the data went the other way. This is sort of the issue we run up into here. Is a lot of popular coverage treats the term science to refer to the vague method of expert study and deduction, right? Rather than a look at what is generally objective and measurable and quantifiable specifically, which is what science is, right? So a lot of questions of religion. Now, religion is a far more nebulous topic than science. It describes the general relationship of humanity and what is transcendent, and how human cultures draw that relationship, right? And perform it. But methodology and scientifically testable ideas can be included within the body of religion, but religious ideas are not necessarily scientific or overlapping with anything that could be considered scientific.
I suspect that there are a lot of people who simply aren't acquainted with the categorical differences, for whom this is a lot more muddy. But I feel like if you have a familiarity with some of these categorical epistemological differences, that it becomes an easier field to negotiate. But it's many, many nuanced topics built on top of each other. And one thing I have to say is on Dank Christian memes, we don't actually see a lot of discussions along this. We don't actually see a lot of the debate. I think that that's happening elsewhere on the internet. But nonetheless, we do occasionally see folks fall into what I'll call stereotyping of each other. So I want to throw this up for both of you. How much of this is are we really talking about Christian, what I'm going to call essentialism? And please feel free to correct. I'm just kind of making this term up as I go. but like determining that this issue, this fact, so like last time we talked about creationism, that what you think about the creation of the earth, how old it is, and the process, if any, of its creation, that is an essential to your identity. The way other people would say, the Trinity is essential to Christianity. And
or a comparable historical claim might be the resurrection of Jesus, right?
Right. The resurrection of Jesus is pretty untestable. So, and I feel comfortable saying that. I'm also not looking for tests. But so, for me, I find, so I'm going to say something. I feel like this would make him angry. I like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I like when he makes issues more, accessible. I feel sometimes like Neil deGrasse Tyson is preaching the wonders of science to me, and that I find it spiritually enjoyable and even empowering, much the way that I would a sermon. And I'm afraid that if I said this to him, he would punch me in the face. I do not think he's a violent person at all. I'm sure he would take it fine. But I feel like that is kind of the opposite of what he would hope. I don't know. So, I obviously have respect for Neil deGrasse Tyson, but this is the place where I see myself crossing over, not, I saw the pictures from James Webb Telescope, and I think we have even more pictures now coming out. And this was a perfect example of me being awestruck by something. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson explains what I'm actually looking at, and I feel even more awestruck by it. Mm-hmm. And those things are great and exciting, and also why the theme for Dank Christian memes is based around the cosmic eclipse image. So am I alone here, or do we think that there's other to what extent are people really focused on these essential items, and to what extent are people just focusing on what works for them? Is this an argument that's only happening among those who are seeking arguments, or is this actually a defining issue for the church, Protestant, Catholic, or however?
I'll bring up one of my favorite historical figures in the history of science here, who I know struggled with this question. Charles Darwin was actually educated as a minister. Not that he ever wanted it. His father wanted that for him, but his background was in ministry. However, his personal interests led him to constantly looking at geology and natural history and whatnot, right? If you read the private correspondences of Charles Darwin, you will find that before, like, evolution had already been an issue that was discussed before among biologists, but it wasn't super widespread before the publication of Origin of Species among the public, right? And in Darwin's very writings, in his personal correspondences with his wife, who was very devout, she expressed issues with the implications of his ideas of evolution of natural selection and what they meant for sort of the idea of humankind as a special creation in God's image. Darwin struggled with this too. Darwin was a nearly lifelong agnostic, and he was bothered by it in a different way, in more so the way that he was worried about public response. But I think that there is something that's illustrated there, which is that this isn't an issue that we have to pretend that people don't come to fairly naturally. It's something that's been there since before the issue was publicly raised in the collective consciousness of society, right? The dichotomy between scientific discoveries or observations and religious ideas and their presumed conflict is something that has existed forever. That's not to say that there aren't loads of us who are fine with both. I'm fine with both things. I think all three of us here are people who believe that religion and science can coexist very well. But I don't think that you have to look for that conflict in order to experience it. I think it's something that people struggle with as they struggle rationalizing any ideas that are difficult to wrestle with, right? This is something we go through with a bunch of things, not just this issue.
Well, and I wanted to ask, there's also the issue of health science, which wouldn't be its own topic of discussion were it not for the recent COVID-19 pandemic. But I don't know that people's opinions on whether or not you need to mask in church, I don't know that people are coming to that with a scientific or religious mind, or I imagine it's quite a passé issue for most communities at this point. But Andrew, in the Catholic sense, do we see a hesitancy? Because Catholicism is a global religion. Is there any indication from your perspective that, some parts of the global denomination of Catholicism have an issue with some, medicines and advances, whether they be vaccines or anything like that? Or are most people pretty excited to get access to, new technology and new life-saving technology? I know I've laid a huge question on you.
Yeah.
But is there conflict within the church on this, or are most people looking at Pope Francis and the Jesuit tradition? You'd think everyone would be pretty down, but again, I don't want to paint the Catholic Church to be a monolith when it's a global it's a global experience.
Yeah. Well, and you both have to paint it as a monolith while also realizing that monolith will not be 100% accurate, right? So I will speak in terms of like the Catholic Academy and like the the theology of the magisterium, so kind of the party line, so to speak. Because individual, at least to start with, because individual experience is more complicated. Generally, the Catholic Church is very for scientific advancement, especially in the world of medicine. There are some ethical.
There are many Catholic hospitals still, correct?
Yeah. So for Catholics, healthcare is a huge part of Catholic ministry, and it has been, and it goes biblically. Part of what it really traces back to is the corporal works of mercy. So, in Matthew, when the parable of the sheep and the goats, and you have Jesus saying, whatever you did for the least of these, right? And it's visiting the sick and or caring for the sick and visiting the imprisoned and clothing the naked and all those. So those things are called the corporal works of mercy. So caring for the sick is very much a part of the Catholic ethic, and very much at the heart of how Catholics see themselves in the world. And there has been a phenomenal army of brothers and sisters and priests throughout the generations who have built healthcare systems that have been the basis of many modern healthcare systems. Specifically, the healthcare system in the Kingdom of Hawaii, which later became the state of Hawaii, was pretty much built by Franciscan nuns. So, one of the largest healthcare institutions in the United States, Providence St. Joseph, which is all up and down the West Coast, was founded by the Sisters of Providence. So, yeah. So in that regard, and there's not conflict in the general pursuit of science and health science. There are, having to do with Catholic ethics around life and understanding around life, there are certain parameters on how those things should be conducted. So, for instance, some stem cell research is generally frowned upon and not really, quote unquote, allowed by the Catholic Church, because a lot of those, in most cases, the stem cells that you use for research are stem cells that you'd be getting from fetuses. So that creates a complication around Catholic life ethic, which, parlay into all the same debates around issues like abortion. So there's some of that. I'd say there's a lot of beginning of life and end of life.
Well, and I want to take a little note here, because I said that Dank Christian Memes doesn't usually argue about issues of science versus religion or health science versus religion. However, there is an exception regarding abortion. But I see most people who engage in the topic, and oftentimes the topic is not being engaged in kind-heartedness or with delicacy. So these conversations don't actually get approved sometimes. But that it's a philosophical approach, that it's not a scientific one, because I think a philosophical approach is far more accessible and probably closer to the religious starting point that many people have. I'm not seeing a lot of people, getting down to the science, which it sounds like you're saying is, the science is there. Here's where the line is. Here's what we're comfortable with, and here are the reasons for it.
Yes, but the science is based off of philosophical and theological ideas. So, you can't really prove that life does or does not begin at conception. But the theological and philosophical stance of the Catholic
Church, another non-testable scenario.
Well, let's also make a distinction here, because when people refer to life there, they're referring to a sort of spiritual life. Yes. Biological life is continuous through that, from a biological definition. It is. Yeah. It is just the division of cells, as they say.
Yeah. So let's say ensoulment. So you can debate when ensoulment happens, but based on the Catholic Church's position that begins at the moment of conception, then there are implications for scientific research and scientific, just medical practice, right? So that's why the Catholic Church is against abortion. On the flip side, on kind of the other end of life, the Catholic Church is also against euthanasia, which comes from a theological opinion having to do with humans can't choose when people die. That it's murder. So the Catholic Church would also then be against essentially research into execution methods. So there's kind of that point where the two meet, and there's a distinct separation. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about when I was quoting Pope Leo about theologians and scientists staying in their lanes. That there are theological ideas that then have implications for what we do and do not do, and do and do not study in science.
This is where I feel like what folks don't understand about Christianity in general is just how many different Christian ethics there are. And I think that people oftentimes, like I said, the monolith, they want to understand, well, what's the Christian position on this? What do religious people think about that? And I think it lends people to taking positions that they are far more embattled on than they are informed on, right? That I'm not seeing a lot of links to, papal documents. I have seen them, but not a lot of them. Like, some people are, and that's what's great about our community is someone is like, well, here's what this person said, much like you're doing for us right now. But there's a lot of folks that are, for lack of, I don't want to use the word extreme because that word is getting thrown around a lot, but I'm just going to keep using the word embattled. And I feel like these are the folks that are getting the most attention, but are probably the least likely to lead us to a helpful place. Maybe that's just me being judgmental. I do that sometimes. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, and when it comes to that monolith of Christianity, there's diversity within that. I obviously was just now speaking about the Catholic position. But there are a variety of churches that have a variety of different ideas about the theology and philosophy around life, and then how that implicates health sciences, or science in general. You can't. I can definitely speak in certain ways for the Catholic Church, but not for everyone. But to answer your second question, in relation to, or I guess to continue answering your question, but with my kind of second distinctions. That was the church and the magisterium. But the kind of on the ground practice theology, way of life of Catholics in this context of science and health science can be greatly varied. There are parts of the world that are very, and I think it's somewhat has to do with medical literacy and scientific literacy. That are obviously going to be very like pro-vaccine and pro-various scientific medical advancements, and there will be other parts that will want to tend toward more traditional ways of medicine, more traditional ways of living. For instance, I think a good example is in Tyrol, which is a region of Austria, so kind of south, western Austria, and then crosses into northern Italy, there in the mountains. It's still a pretty traditional kind of country, pastoral part of Austria. And even though it's in Europe, which is, quote unquote, advanced society, like spiritual warfare, it's still a part of their understanding of psychological medicine. While we would probably hear, in our position, all three of us being rather well-educated people in the United States, would probably always be like, oh, psychological things have to do with your mental health, go see a therapist, medication, stuff like that. In Tyrol, it's still, and decreasingly so, but still somewhat common for people to seek out a priest for exorcism for people who are experiencing very severe mental health issues.
This is I read about this in a book called Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. It discusses the life of Paul Farmer, who sadly passed away recently, but left quite a legacy behind. And he found, I believe it was in Haiti, that he was having better health outcomes when he addressed not only the medical issue, but also whatever spiritual, social issues were also there, sort of like you're describing that, acknowledging the cultural presence is leading to better outcomes. And there may be, a number of different reasons for that. But that was something that I, found fascinating. So I don't think that Paul Farmer was necessarily a Christian, but I do think a good number of Christians sort of look up to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think there's an interesting blending, I think, of science and religion that one has to do in the medical field. This is why, chaplains are a part of people's medical teams in hospitals. And I think it's for a variety of reasons. I think one of which is there will probably be people who are, if they have to choose between science and religion, are going to choose religion, right? So they might choose to do or not do something based on their religious understanding of the world. So to use the Tyrol example again, someone having severe mental health crisis, depending on your worldview and your understanding, maybe you're going to call the priest instead of the doctor because you see it as a spiritual matter as opposed to a medical matter. And you're maybe going to be more resistant to forms of medical treatment. So, yeah, it's interesting.
I have one more question, but I want to throw it up. Thank you very much. Yes. And thank you for taking my meandering question to a very precise answer. I really appreciate how well you've done that. I want to acknowledge our audience. Thank you for being here, audience. If you guys have questions, you can pop them in comments. I can't see the comments, but I'm getting the impression that you can, Jacob. Is that true?
I see them here, yeah.
That's must be nice.
If you want to open the comments, there is a little show chat button up in the upper right of the Discord room here.
I press it and it seems unresponsive to me. I think I may be experiencing some sort of technical deficiency. So I'm going to throw out my last question. But yeah, if folks have questions or want to contribute something, text is probably the best way. I'm using the app, and I think maybe that's why if I weren't on my phone, things would probably work better. So I mentioned this before, that it seems like, and I think you were kind of saying this a little bit, Andrew, too. Stop me if I get off track here. That a lot of folks are kind of embattled, and that if they sense that there's a fight between religion or their religion or the church and religion or in science, they're gonna grab the flag of their side and they're gonna wave it as hard as they can. I just get the sense that those folks, while they mean well and are surely very passionate, that they're not the same people that come to the negotiating table. Am I being too idealistic to think that we could have debates between Protestant leaders, between Catholic bishops, between maybe Jewish and Muslim leaders as well, and have conversations that maybe aren't so much about what's right, but what we have in common and what is dissimilar. And especially if we're looking at something as broad as Abrahamic faiths, like am I dreaming? Is there space for a more nuanced conversation here, or is the foolish part that I think that it's going to come from the leadership? Is it actually going to come from somewhere else? So this is my final weird question. It's a toss up if anyone wants to jump on it.
I have some very strong opinions on this, so I'll be happy to jump on this.
All right.
I think it, so just to kind of give some context, one of my feelings of call-in ministry is ecumenical dialogue. And I feel that, dialogue between fellow Christians of different denominations. And I feel that science is very much a part of that. I think that our wonderment at the world and how we view the world and try to understand the hand of God within this crazy and complicated world is very much a part of those dialogues. And I think when we can marvel together at the beauty of creation and at the kind of astounding things that science teaches us about the universe, I think that can be an area of common ground. So I have a lot of friends in the Anglican tradition, both in the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of North America. And one thing I have found is that, whatever common things our three groups can agree on is a good starting point. And to my knowledge, both groups are very pro-science. So, the Catholic Church can really get together with the Anglican Communion on matters of science. And if that's a good start, I think any starting point is a good starting point. So I think that, yes, it can and should be. I think you see ways in which the Vatican has its own scientific institutions, and there are plenty of non-Catholics and even non-Christians that are part of those institutions. Because, they believe that if you want to come and you want to do the science and you want to do the research, even if we don't believe in the same God or the same things about Jesus, we want you to be part of that. So I think it is definitely a point of bridge building, and I think it should continue to be so, and probably doesn't get as much focus as certain other things might. So yeah, I think there's potential for growth, but I also think there's some work already being done within the field of science to help Christians and non-Christians get along.
Well, and, maybe the goal should be, make sure you're at least more polite than Galileo was.
I think that's a good start. I think not trying to start political fights is a good place to start.
What do you think about the potential of nuanced discourse on the topic, Jacob? Am I dreaming, or have our comments given you a little hope?
I think I think it happens. It's not impossible when it happens. There's plenty of people who participate in ecumenical discussions, as well as discussions over boundaries of religiosity in the first place. In many ways, we wouldn't be sitting here if we weren't interested in ecumenical discussion. But I think that I think the difficulty is framing that. You used the word debate earlier, and I tend to shy away from that word because formal debate as it exists...
That makes a lot of sense.
Formal debate as it exists sort of publicly is a sport. It is not actually a way of solving issues. It is a way of doing sort of performative argument making. It doesn't solve problems. It actually just boosts the egos of two people. I think it's more realistic to talk about goals that you want to solve together. If that goal is increasing cooperation on questions of sustainability, or lowering interreligious conflict, or these are goals that are specific, and we can gather people together to discuss them and have them hopefully come towards something. Platforming two people to argue about if science and religion are compatible is just not a useful use of time. All it is playing with that issue as a spectator game.
What comes to mind is the movie Religulous, where I think it's Bill Maher was his name, basically punches down at a bunch of really unsuspecting, niche people who are in many cases just like, a few of were just actors. One was like a truck stop preacher that like he was looking to best people. He wasn't looking for, genuine discourse. Mm-hmm. And to that end, I'm thankful that, we have a community or perhaps an interlinking of communities here that we can share, a bit of discourse. Do we have questions before we move towards final thoughts? I don't want to cut anybody off here.
I want to ask a question to you guys.
What? Okay, yeah,
Yes.
That sounds good.
So I've got a question, and it is my favorite science and religion question. What are your thoughts on extraterrestrial life?
I think we're going to cover this when we get to our conspiracy episodes. And to clarify, thinking aliens are real isn't a conspiracy theory. Thinking the government is hiding that aliens is real, that's the conspiracy theory. I think I'm with the Pope on this. If they're chill with Jesus, cool. If they're not chill with Jesus, probably best to not try to convince them. I mean, I'm guessing they're sporting some pretty good tech. We should be polite. Don't be like Galileo. Don't, that's my view. If they're down with Jesus, yeah, come aboard. If they're not, like, all right, respect. Like, let's not fight. Your technology is obviously very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. It's yet to be proven whether or not there is extraterrestrial life, and although if you've been watching U.S. news, there's a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who said something. So which, as someone who fell down accidentally the Instagram conspiracy theory rabbit hole and is kind of obsessed, has been flooding my Instagram stream, and I'm pretty sure Meta now thinks I'm like some crazy conspiracy theorist and not like a sane individual who's just fascinated by it. But so it's yet to be proven, right? But I think if it does exist, yeah, I have like Broclen said, if they want to share in the Christian faith, glad to have them. That's also we're assuming, right, that this is like life with a certain level of sentientness and cognitive. We're not just talking about bacteria, right? We're talking about like little green men who could communicate with us and have.
I'm going to be Pope Francis, and I'm going to preach to the space whales. And that's going to be what that's going to be my path to sainthood.
There you go. But I think, I think if they want to join the faith. I think you just treat them like you would any human. So I think there is an interesting theological question though, in if sin entered the world in Adam, and some of us, aka Catholics among others, believe that we inherited original sin from Adam. You'd have to ask the question of, okay, so do aliens have original sin? Yeah. So there's a whole
C.S. Lewis wrote about that. C.S. Lewis wrote about that. He suspected that there might be alien worlds that did not fall into sin, and that we going there might corrupt them.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely that would be a whole discussion and bridge to cross if and when we get there. So yeah, we shall see with time. But
I'm just sorry. What Jacob said makes it sound like we would be the demons invading their world. That's
I did once hear someone like give the theory that like the parable of like the 99 and the one lost sheep. That like humanity, and maybe C.S. Lewis talks about this. I don't know. Someone just like said this to me once, and I was like, "Oh, okay." I don't know what I'm gonna do with that information. But was his thing was that humanity was the one lost sheep and so Jesus, the shepherd, was sent to like retrieve us and bring us back to the 99, which are like the alien civilizations that didn't fall. So I don't know. It's
the idea of 99 other species like watching us each day on reality TV. Like, come on, guys, you can do this. We're rooting for you.
We believe in you. Yeah.
Have you heard of the zoo hypothesis? This is pivoting from the religious question to the Fermi paradox. I know this is like off topic, but this is my favorite thing to talk about. If you're unaware of the Fermi paradox, it is the question of if the universe is so large and there are so many chances for life, why don't we detect civilization? It's not a real paradox, it's just a question. But I think it's a more fanciful, but it's fun to think about hypothesis, is what's called the zoo hypothesis, where humanity is basically just kept to observe by the other civilizations, and they have an agreement to not talk to us. That's what your thing reminds me of.
Maybe that's not so bad. and they're not talking to us. Maybe that's the gift.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, well, again, I can't load the comments. So, do we have any comments to attend to?
We might have one coming in a second. There's some comments, but I Eat Printers for Fun has said question, and I'm waiting for the question to be typed.
All right, currently loading the question. Just a side note while we're waiting, I think that I may have mentioned this before, that like we live in a time where I think there's a lot of folks out there that want you to believe that if you don't have an embattled opinion, then you don't have an opinion that's worth having. And like, I think there's a lot of folks that either fall into a middle ground or just aren't thinking about certain questions that, it's hard to consider. That's, there are some days, generally our community is very good and I'm very thankful to moderate, but there are some days that are very, very challenging. But on those days, I have to remember this isn't most days, and this isn't, all topics and all things. But I think that we do have a social media situation where, especially due to certain mechanical changes, the best voices don't always come to the top, or at least maybe not the most nuanced voices come to the top.
Yeah, at times. All right, here's the question. I Eat Printers for Fun has asked, this is, I guess, a hypothetical situation. If the alien civilizations don't know about Jesus and people who don't know about Jesus but still are good people go to heaven, isn't the best way to make sure the most aliens go to heaven is to not tell them about him?
The missionary paradox. Or that's what I call it. I don't know if I'm making it up.
So that assumes the free pass if you keep them ignorant, they get a free pass. Therefore, the prime directive is to not share about Jesus. The first rule of Jesus Club is don't talk about Jesus Club.
I have never thought of this. I've never thought of this.
So there is some precedence for theology that believes in this idea of basically the virtuous pagan goes to heaven. Mm-hmm. And I think let me Google this really quick just to make sure I have this. Okay,
always
so Irenaeus of Lyon, or not Irenaeus, sorry. That's Ignatius of Lyon. Saint Irenaeus, who wrote the famous book Against Heresies, has this idea. I'm a huge fan of Against Heresies. Has this idea essentially that virtuous pagans probably go to heaven, but then that begs the question: so is the most Christian thing to do then to not tell anyone about Jesus? And I don't have an answer for that.
I'm going to go a step further.
Fascinating question.
So telling people about Jesus, maybe it depends about how you tell about Jesus, and I'm going to take the good place approach. If you tell them about heaven and hell, then you corrupt their motivations, and that they're not just loyal to God, they're just trying to avoid hell and get into heaven. So if you don't tell people about heaven and hell, then they can have truly virtuous intentions in their moral actions. They're not just doing it for their just desserts. So I think this applies in a bunch of weird ways, but I really like moral and theological thought experiments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think too, there's this idea of, and so C.S. Lewis, right, and goes back to that too, this idea of okay, did the aliens actually fall? Because if the aliens didn't fall, then they don't need Jesus.
I mean, Jesus also came specifically as a human, not as a Harthi from the largest moon of the largest hot Jupiter in this binary system that we found, right?
Yeah. So I think it's and most of Christian theology is very much this concept of sin enters the world through Adam. which is something the Catholic Church still holds today. Just to tie it back, fun fact. Yeah, they believe that basically everyone's related to one single human, and that human brought sin into the world, and therefore that human is quote unquote Adam. And so then there's this framework of then, because sin enters the world through a human, and then Jesus comes as a human to redeem the world. And that framework, which goes back to the early church fathers, the first few councils, there's volumes and volumes of patristic
Didn't
theology.
St. Nicholas punch someone over this homoousion issue? Like, it was spicy.
But it's a myth that arises later after his
Yeah.
time.
It's a myth I choose to perpetuate.
Supposedly, Nicholas punched Arius at Nicaea and was jailed for it briefly.
Yeah. And because of the Greek, this led one church father to comment that the problem was only one iota of the difference between the two sides. But it's puns.
That's a good one.
It's a good one. That one hit pretty hard when we in church history class, when my very serious professor, was telling the story, and then ends it with, and so he commented, there was only one iota of difference. But to get back to the point, so that whole framework only works within the context of humanity. So I think there'd be a lot of theological questions that would open up with.
I'm going to speak in favor of what I'm just going to call parallelism, that anything that could happen with humanity could theoretically be replicated with a different sentient species. They could fall, they could be redeemed, Jesus could come and reconcile homoousion whatever, this other version of homoousion Z, I don't know, whatever we decide to call the embodiment of the alien species, that Jesus, surely having reconciled with humans, could reconcile to them as well. Although we like to imagine aliens that didn't crucify Jesus, because it seems like they might be a little more friendly to us. So there's that. That to think about as well.
Have you all heard the joke about the aliens and Jesus coming to Earth? Okay, so I'm just going to tell it.
That
I think so. But
Jesus...
yes, please repeat it for the audience.
Yeah. So the joke is basically some aliens come to Earth, and they're taking me to your leader, all that stuff, and they're having a conversation. The Pope's involved, and the Pope says something about, do you know about Jesus? Because he's very just curious, like, how does this work? And he's like, oh yeah, we love Jesus. That guy comes to our planet like every few years. And the Pope goes, my goodness, every few years, like. How? What? And he says, well, whenever he comes, we gather all the best chocolate on our planet. We give it to him as a departing present, so he comes back. Why? What did you guys do when he showed up? Yeah.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, silly joke, but very entertaining.
I love how we went from science in the church to aliens, which feels like the getting ahead topic. Yeah. Like, I've seen it memed a bit. I've seen it discussed a bit. If the Pope talks about it, I feel like the Pope, this is one of the more savvy things the Pope has done. Like, people ask him this question, he's like, oh yeah, we baptized aliens, no problem. I feel like the journalists are like, oh yeah, good stuff. This is gonna get the clicks.
Delicious.
Yeah. So just to jump back to the science really quickly, church and religion. One point that I wanted to bring up that I didn't get to bring up earlier was one of the wisdoms of going to an ecumenical divinity school is we do often deal with the discrepancies in the faith between various Christian bodies. And I feel like myself and some others have developed this saying of, again, well, it's not creedal, as kind of a way to say, it's okay to disagree. And what we mean by that is, it's not in the, Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which is the core document of Christianity. And it's if we can agree on that, that's common ground. And interestingly, or at least I think is interestingly, like science is not really a part of that, right? Like outside of God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, there's very little about science, like that is maybe the only thing you can bring back to science.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just an interesting thing for the non-contradiction between science and religion. And we can, through science, show how the universe was created, but we can't say who created it or why it was created. So,
or to nuance the Big Bang Theory discussion, we can model the early processes following its creation. Because one of the very common misreadings of the Big Bang Theory that people do is it's not a description of how the universe came to be. It's a description of the mathematical extension of the physical laws we understand them into the deep past to model how the early universe behaved. The catalyst for the Big Bang Theory is not described in its theory, or in the theory itself, generally in its basic format.
Yeah. So, yeah. And also, fun fact: one of the earliest people who worked on the Big Bang Theory was a Jesuit priest. So,
yeah,
non-contradiction.
George Lemaitre.
Yeah.
I think for my final little comment is just whenever I encounter a Christian essentialism that doesn't focus on Christ, I'm gonna raise an eyebrow to that, if your Christian essentialism is based on a scientific proposition, you may have a good point, but I may struggle to find it. that's just me being honest, and I think
true Christians are some variant of string theorist, Broclen.
Well, I have a pile of books to order if you'll excuse me. Other than Jacob's condemnations, any final thoughts before I read our show notes here? Thank you, everyone, for the answers that were often better than the questions I asked in the first place. I will take your silence as no one's objecting, no one's fighting me. Well, thank you so much, both of you, again. Thanks for getting season 2 started. Thank you for our Discord audience. Again, it's really great to have you guys with us. This has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. If you would like to connect with our community further, we have social links in our description. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.
Wait to the waves of the stereo. Wait to the waves of the stereo. This is my sanctuary, and we are the choir. This is my sanctuary.